Hello, I am here today to talk to you about composition. Composition is a term that we use to describe what we see in a work of art that is using the elements and principles of art and design. The elements and principles of art and design are the building blocks for the visuals that you see in front of you when you're looking at any piece of artwork. So if I'm looking at any of the works that were created by students last year on this slide, I can see that they are using things like line, color, value, shape, form, texture, space, emphasis, balance, rhythm, harmony, pattern, contrast, proportion, unity, and variety. When I'm looking at these works, I can comment on how they're using, for example, space. I can see that this piece here is using three-dimensional space because it's an actual three-dimensional model, whereas this student here is using space on a two-dimensional surface by showing perspective. So when we're looking at any artwork, we're thinking about the vocabulary terms that you see here, and that feeds into what we think about in terms of the overall composition. When you're creating work in this class, and you're coming up with whatever your final piece is going to be, it's important to consider the composition when you're planning out your thumbnail sketches. A thumbnail sketch is a small, quick sketch to give you an idea of what it is you want to make. Thumbnail sketches are important in your work for the planning process because it allows you to quickly get down ideas, share them with other people, get feedback, and then make your ideas even better and your final work even better based on that feedback. We use thumbnail sketches because they're quick, inexpensive, and they help you solidify your idea of what it is that you want to make and also what you don't want to make while you're coming up and brainstorming with what your work is going to look like. As you can see for these students, they are both doing thumbnail sketches in their planning guide as well as in their sketchbook. So you can use both surfaces as areas to plan. Each one of them is thinking about what the border of their page is going to look like, as well as how the image is going to exist within that page. You'll also notice that with their sketches, each one is slightly different. They might be dealing with the same topic or the same idea or the same theme, but each one addresses that topic or idea or theme in a different way. So when you are coming up with your sketches, you want them to be unique from one another. When I'm thinking about doing thumbnail sketches, I'm not thinking about them being perfect. As you can see here in my thumbnail sketches, they're all slightly different from one another. They're pretty sketchy, and they are relatively rough in terms of their overall outline. In addition to having them be very quick sketches and not perfect, they also give some additional information that I want to remind myself of for when I actually go and make my final piece. One thing is that it's saying how big it's going to be, both in height and width. In this one, it's also, because it's three-dimensional, showing it from multiple points of view. In addition to showing the size, you could also include notes about what colors you're going to use, and then also what media you're planning to use. So is it going to be clay, or is it going to be cardboard, or is it going to be paint and paper or digital art? So all of these things help you better understand what it is you want to make and also communicate it with others so that they can see that what your idea is going to be and then give you feedback. You can also use, again, your planning guide and put that in your planning guide, or you can work within those sketchbooks that you have, what you want to do for your sketch. When you're coming up with your thumbnail sketches, one of the first things that you have to decide when you're creating the little border for your picture plane or your paper is it going to be landscape oriented or is it going to be portrait oriented? Portrait is taller than it is wide. Landscape is wider than it is tall. Just because they're called portrait and landscape doesn't mean you have to put a portrait in a portrait-oriented paper or a landscape in a landscape-oriented paper. You can really put anything in there, as you can see from the two examples of portrait paper direction and the two examples of the landscape paper direction. After you decide sort of how you want your paper to be on the page, like is it going to be long or is it going to be tall, the next thing that you have to decide is how is it going to be balanced? Is it going to be symmetrical, meaning that you have that invisible line of symmetry and it's mirrored on both sides to reflect a perfectly balanced image? Or is it going to be asymmetrical, which means on that invisible line of symmetry, one side is slightly different or very different than the other side? These are really good examples of symmetrical balance, and although they might not be a perfect mirrored image, they are mirrored enough to where we would call that approximate symmetry. And then these over here are good examples of asymmetrical balance, because if I were to take my paper and have that imaginary line, one side is not the same as the other at all. However, asymmetrical works are still balanced because although it may not be mirrored one side to the other, there are elements to help balance out the piece. Now, in the case of this work here, the student has the light bulb symmetrically on the page, but what's happening in the light bulb is asymmetrical. So you can play around with those designs. When making the decision of if you're going to make your work symmetrical or asymmetrical, one thing to keep in mind is what kind of message are you saying to the viewer? For works that are asymmetrical, they happen to be a little bit more dynamic and have a little bit more energy and movement to them. Whereas if something is symmetrical, it's a little more orderly and it's a little bit more stable. So you can use composition and balance to help reinforce those concepts. If you are using asymmetry or an asymmetrical work, one thing to consider is using rule of thirds. Rule of thirds states that your subject should be aligned to either area where the paper is divided into thirds both horizontally and vertically, and where those would intersect. So if I look at each of these pieces, they are using the rule of thirds. They have their subject either anchored to the top or the bottom, or it's anchored to the left or the right. So for example, if I were to take those imaginary grid marks and divide that into thirds both horizontally and vertically, where the parrot is looking is that upper third area. Same thing for this piece. The subject of the girl's head is using that upper third area. For this one, it's also using the upper third area, but it's over on this side. And then same thing with the tree and the opening. You might notice that in your camera, it comes up with a grid like that. And that's because photography, often you are encouraged to use the rule of thirds to help make sure that you have the most dynamic and interesting image you possibly can. Now, when you're designing your composition with your thumbnail sketches, it's really important to consider the elements and principles. It's important to consider what way your paper is going to be placed or if it's going to be three-dimensional. It's really important to consider both balance as well as placement of your subject. So be mindful of that as you begin to plan out your sketches for your work that you're going to do in this class. Each challenge, you will have to create multiple sketches, and I'm really excited to see all of the things that you come up with. So happy creating, and I can't wait to see what you do.